All righty. Oh, welcome to Dis and Dat. Today, going to look at Code of Capital, Katharina Pistor's Code of Capital. Uh, I included a review today, which hopefully is useful. I think I have a copy uploaded of Code of Capital. There were some important points in using this, and I think you'll see hopefully why we've gone through this little progression about discussing law and capital, capital itself, where we're looking at capital elsewhere, while we're sort of stuck in volume two of capital. But uh, the point I think I'm coming to is that the law helps explain some of the issues of capital. More specifically, it's the way in which we can explain certain circuits of capital, more specifically uh, financial capital or finance capital, which is the sort of underserved area. I mean, it does, it's certainly an area that's written a great deal about after Marx's death. Less so, but not completely forgotten in Marx's work. I just think that it becomes more complete and maybe diverted, perhaps, in the case of Engels. But as I've said before, it's not a straight path for us in looking at capital volumes two and three. So Pistor's book, The Code of Capital, is important in the sense that it provides a bridge, not the bridge, a bridge to between law and political economy, and I think it's a useful text. And it has clarity, of course, for non-experts, as subtitle specifies how the law creates wealth and inequality. Now, it has, of course, its own limitations about in terms of definitional elements, so that we need to sort of work through a little bit. And I think that the discussion of financial capital, and hence, as we've looked at before, the the issues of financial geography are also important in this case. So capital is made from two ingredients: an asset in very broad sense, including any object, skill, or idea, and the legal code. So you can see that if you describe capital that way, it allows you to discuss some of the things that were less apparent to Marx, less applicable. For example, intellectual capital, intellectual property, etc. The code refers to the laws of property, contracts, trusts, financial intermediaries, and corporations that are able to transform an asset into capital, and thereby generate private wealth in a capitalist system. Because of its focus on the institutions of capitalism, the book could be rechristened The Code of Capitalism rather than that of capital. Doing so would also highlight that it renews and extends many insights originally introduced by John Commons, that is John Commons' Legal Foundations of Capitalism of 1924, and only partially developed by another person who's interested in John Commons' work, and that is Oliver Williamson in the Economic Institutions of Capitalism. There's an entire further development of this in economics on the issues of institutionalism and new institutionalism, and I think those are also part of this larger discussion. That is that this is not talking so much about heavy machinery as it is talking about contracts and warrants and other kinds of things. The book shows the evolution of this coding in the history of capitalism from the coding of traditional assets such as land, and note that land is coded not so much by the monarchy. It is, but it is also coded by the church for all the usual kinds of reasons. And having that kind of data is actually kind of important from a feudal point of view, but also that reinvigorates, I suppose, if you're going to talk about techno-feudalism, that's kind of where we are with more uh, abstract or digital property. The evolution continued with less tangible assets such as financial products and intellectual property rights. Finally, Peace Store reflects upon future scenarios such as the smart contract. You know, the later development of the coding of corporations is part of this. But note, of course, that if you're thinking more historically, um, you know, feudalism is a corporate system. It's simply not as well organized.
So, and I'd like to talk to you about it, like when you have time. So you didn't go out and drink.
In all cases, uh, and its coding based on blockchain technology. In all cases, according to Peace Store, there are several common key attributes of capital, namely priority, durability, universality, and convertibility. So you can see how certain elements applied in an abstract sense to capital are actually part of this whole process and further articulate the same kinds of issues of capital, the intergenerational wealth stuff. You don't get intergenerational wealth unless you have, you know, sort of legal stuff to connect everything. Um, Priority ranks legal positions, privileging certain titles of one asset holder over others. Moreover, rights over assets can be extended in time, lending them durability and allowing capital to grow. Hence, durability adds a temporal component to the priority attribute. Universality ensures that priority and durability will be upheld against others. Finally, thanks to convertibility, asset holders have an option to convert their assets into value, like money. So, thanks to these four or so attributes that are coded in laws, any asset can be turned into capital and thereby create or increase wealth for asset holders. In addition, as wealth exists only by virtue of legal coding, that is, the law's definition protection, so wealth inequality also derives from the legal coding of capital. Capital is therefore linked with the power of the lawmakers, and as Peace Store points out, lawyers are the keepers and the masters of the code. This favors those who can afford lawyers, especially lawyers trained at the best schools and hired by top law firms. Using the lens of the code of capital, global capitalism is therefore linked not only to the major players in global finance, but also to the top global law firms. So, Peace Store's book, in the tradition of old institutionalists such as Adolf Berle, Robert Lee Hale, Thorstein Veblen, probably the one everyone is most familiar with in terms of institutionalism. Conspicuous consumption, I suppose, being the idea of most, leisure class stuff that Veblen is identified with, and the above mentioned John Commons. According to the old institutionalism, each economic transaction is based on legal rights over economic assets. Namely, using the terminology of Peace Store, the value or wealth deriving from an economic transaction relies on the legal coding process. Moreover, each jural position has an adversarial or positional nature, such that the set of claims of one party imposes duties on one or more other parties. Now, you can see that the state, more specifically, for example, the local state, can intervene on this for all kinds of reasons. You know, your building is not up to code, et cetera, et cetera. This produces asymmetries, namely benefits or advantages for the first party, but also costs for others, resulting in inequalities. Then the problem of growing inequality, to which French political economist Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, drew the world's attention, ultimately derives from legal coding rather than economic factors. And this is the most important message of Pistore's book and institutionalists in general. There's institutionalism um, retains a kind of position. Some people don't admit that they're institutionalists, et cetera, but that was very important for a lot of folks because they wanted to resist some of the purely theoretical elements of neoclassicism. This was in the 1980s. I've included a little, as brief as possible, interview with Pistore, um, and for your pleasure. If you boil it down to the PowerPoint sort of bullet points, it takes a legal system or two to code capital. In other words, it's sort of it's an encoding and decoding process. An economy based on private initiative depends on adaptive or malleable law. Property law has long been a prerogative of the territorial nation state. Location, yet not all assets have a location. This is a thing that I'm sort of more interested in, the question of, the idea of displacement actually is kind of important. For example, in the case of migration, how portable are your human rights? Digital economy in tension with the analog property rights, globalization of intellectual property rights, the various versions of that, expansive protection of private property rights constrained states, no expropriation without fair market compensation. That's the sort of takings idea. Protection of expectation affects future change. So protecting expectation has a certain idea about it, and you can see that financial products would have that kind of thing about it. Strategic interventions using the playbook of capital. And so I came across this article it has multiple participants. It's a dialogue and debate where Pistore responds to several authors writing short pieces, and I'm only going to do the first piece and thank your lucky stars. They're talking about Code of Capital. Pistore responds to that, which is, I think, useful, very important to sort of clarify those things, but we won't get to that till perhaps tomorrow. So on the first article is or this first piece is, commentary on the book, Code of Capital. All of these folks talk about it. One specifically, which I may get to tomorrow, as well as the response from Pistore, is a more Marxian kind of approach to it. But generally, they all are of a piece on this. The first one is on the constitutive performativity of the law of capital, which would bog you down with a little too many syllables. But there's something truly insightful about the Code of Capital. It's not only because throughout it, the analysis is underpinned by the observation that the vast majority of accounts of the birth and development of capitalism, capital and capitalism, have been oblivious, or at least superficially aware of its legal fabric. Either the law has been reduced to an instrument for pursuing economic ends, as it happens in many cases within the law and economics movement, or it has been described as an epiphenomenon overdetermined by economic rationality, according to many materialist explanations. There's Marx is there, right? Instead, Pistore's account illuminates how law literally makes capital. It's actually the same kind of point that when I was talking about Pashkanis, that this is sort of the idea that there's some connection between law and capitalism that could, in transition, disappear or become more perhaps transparent under socialism. In order to prove this startling claim, Peace Store's first move is to disentangle the concept of capital from those conceptions that represent it either as the dialectic, riddled with its usual contradictions, between factor of production on one hand and the idea that capital is a process of progressive commodification of everything human and non-human on the other hand. It should be quickly added that she does not deny that commodification actually happens in the creation of capital, and law is obviously involved in that. The problem is that commodification is far from sufficient to explain how capital produces wealth. This is the point that Piketty is sort of at. The entire process is, and the concept of accumulation is of a wealth building process. In other words, capital cannot be defined only on the basis of the formation and circulation of commodities. There's a quid to it, as in quid pro quo, to it that the process of commodification cannot account for. Capital is not only wealth extracted from social relations and maintained through competitive markets. There has to be another ingredient to be added to the mix for bringing capital to life. And this ingredient is provided by the operations of law. Now, going back to the original, just as an aside here, if you're thinking about circuits of capital, law allows these things to move better. The legal, the contractual elements, and we've talked a little bit about trade in the larger context. Trade and custom have these elements. For these reasons, from a methodological perspective, we are invited to shift the attention from class identity and class struggle to the question of who has access to and control over the legal code and its masters. The landed elites, the long-distance traders and merchant banks, the shareholders of corporations that own production facilities or merely hold assets behind a corporate veil. Instead, the suggestion is to look at how law encodes capital by putting some assets on legal steroids. This is an interesting starting point, as it allows Peace Store to avoid the thorny and ambiguous language of value, as in theory of value, of course, and to focus on a more clearly defined field identified by formal legal operations. An object, it seems any object, is potentially an asset that can be transformed into a source of wealth by a process of legal coding. Hence, law operates as the magic factor in transforming assets into wealth. Accordingly, to grasp how capital is generated, it is important to understand this legal technique of transformation through assemblage or assemblage. As is explained in several chapters of the book, this is a technique offered by a specific body of professionals who, through the mastery of a technical language, bestow 4 legal attributes on an asset, and in this way bootstrap wealth into existence. Note, of course, that land ownership, etc., the whole theories of kind of how is wealth intergenerationally transferred? Who who inherits what? Peace Store distills the most fundamental legal components of capital and explains the nature of their peculiar function. The identification of these 4 attributes and their application to different case studies is one of the most important achievements of this book. The legal coding assembles these attributes with a view to obtaining a number of effects on assets. These attributes are mostly managed by what traditionally have been private law modules, that is, property law, contract law, trust, intellectual property, the law of securities, and bankruptcy law. Though the shadow of the state always looms large behind this set of legal categories. Still, given the creativity of law, there is nothing exhaustive in the list of private law tools for the making of capital. Looking at the 4 attributes illuminates important aspects of capital. The first 2 attributes are priority and universality. Priority applies to the hierarchy of claims over an asset. It shows 2 essential assets of capital. First, the fact that it is fundamentally a relation of credit and debt. And secondly, that the privilege and priority of some creditor, that the privilege and priority of some creditor over others is its essential component. You can see how debt and credit can be, are key elements of this. And of course, when you start applying it to other areas like land, for example, you can see how this can be manipulated. Universality makes sure that these claims will valid erga omnes in all cases. Universality shows another crucial feature of capital cannot materialize if there is no third party to ensure that priority claims can be enforced against everyone else. To avoid any misunderstanding, the notion of the third here does not define the legal nature of an institution. It rather ensures that what is already a legal institution becomes also part of the code of capital. So this is the hovering state, the local state, the whatever. You can see that you can build other kinds of craziness into it, like in sovereignty. However, priority and universality by themselves are not enough to generate capital, while priority and universality would be sufficient to commodify goods. In other words, sort of ubiquity and hierarchy. For Pistor, they do not yet engender capitalism in its full modality. The other two legal attributes of durability and convertibility have to be inserted into the picture. This is why, as I mentioned before, the money is not anything unless it starts to be converted. And the convertibility and durability of value is actually a really important idea. The former, that is durability, ensures that priority is protected over time from too many creditors. Who's first to take all your stuff, while the latter gives access to legal tender, ensuring a link with an asset that is state currency as opposed to, for example, local currency and, in an earlier historical period barter, whose nominal value is not subject to fluctuation. So there's a sort of standards are involved here as well. One of the most original theses of the book is that the history of capitalism is one constant deployment of these four attributes in different combinations. Such an approach provides a powerful angle of observation to Pistor, as she can basically reconstruct the development of modern capitalism according to this interpretive scheme. And that's what we've been the reason why I've been fiddling around with these things. The deep legal structure of capital is therefore the same throughout its various stages, and this is more fundamental than, for example, changes in the modes and relations of production. This is, what Piketty is talking about in terms of the intergenerational kinds of questions about wealth and accumulation. In a nutshell, capital is legally characterized by the entrenchment of privileges. Pistor calls it the feudal calculus, and you can sort of see where she's going with this. Nonetheless, Pistor is also clear in stating that there are differences between capital as it's shaped in the Middle Ages, in the Industrial Age, and in the time of financialization. At this level, an interesting argument can be inferred from the numerous case studies analyzed in the book. Although Pistor does not mention it explicitly, two aspects explain why certain assets acquire or lose value in different epochs, right? Different epochs, the different time frames. The first one is that the coding of certain assets makes possible the emergence of new forms of wealth. The classic case is the rise of the corporation over land ownership as the main source of value. The second aspect is that each epoch of capitalism can be seen as the outcome of a different mix of the four modules. For example, for financial assets, convertibility is more important than durability. Indeed, it is an effective substitute. Other epochs have seen a different amalgamation of these four modules, and this has also changed the understanding of the private law institutions employed for obtaining the right mix. The point forcefully made by Pistor is that different forms of capitalism have been related to various and changing types of social relations, but the qualifying element has always been the mix of the four legal attributes. Okay, so recall that Marx is talking about the social relations of production and, of course, of circulation and consumption. These are all social relations, but it is a mix with legal attributes. It is no surprise that that legal expertise is a major protagonist of the story. It's the lawyers and the merchants or the big law firms of financial capital that gave capital its form. They are the true masters of the code. Needless to say, Shakespeare talking in whatever it is, what's it, Henry the Third, whatever. I can't remember the specific citation, but Shakespeare, talks about what's the first thing that we do is we kill all the lawyers. This reconstruction of the law of capital relies heavily on a certain conception of the legal order and its institutions, while Pistor has provided a healthy and valuable array of arguments for appreciating the importance of law in creating capital. It seems that a lot of work, perhaps too much, is demanded of law. Two aspects of this demanding conception shall be outlined in what follows. The first maintains that the law is a constitutive and rather malleable instrument. Law as code comes across as a performative, which can transform any asset into wealth by virtue of its own performance. The activity and expertise of lawyers are crucial for the performativity of law. You need to have lawyers do stuff. And then, this is why the meter runs when you talk to lawyers. One can spot remarkable parallels here with the work of the late Jan Thomas, historian of Roman law. Thomas noted that Roman law marks the autonomization of the legal order and of its specific performance, putting social relations into form through legal description. You could say that's an adjunct to this, that citizenship, for example, the definitions of citizenship have this element built into it. His intuition is that law is not the instrument in the hands of a previously constituted and naturalized owner, a classic representation of Roman law, etc., Schiavone's work, but a ritual. So it's not the instrument in the hands of a previously constituted and naturalized owner, but a ritual which qualifies things and connects them to persons. Law is what makes things res juris. Quite tellingly, Thomas expands on the idea that the word that denotes things, res, is the same as describes the legal procedure for settling conflicts. In Thomas's reading, law is a performative that names some things as economically valuable and others outside the sphere of commerce. This original division allows certain things to become marketable. The division in itself is not based on a strict ontology, but is a product of the legal technique par excellence, the legal facts. Thomas's lesson is that law can transform assets into appropriable and valuable things. It does not say much about the type of value and about the process of valorization undergirding it. This is the underlying issue of law and economics, is that, how is it that we can come to certain decisions about stuff. The antitrust describes this kind of problem. How is it that we determine domination of a market, for example? Is efficiency always important, et cetera? And as an extended idea, what about social costs? This is the case because his interest lies more in the description of the operations of law than in understanding valorization. That's ultimately what it still comes down to. It's still about, the difference between lawyers who are more interested in justice as opposed to making money for clients. Pistor's description of the performative virtues of the legal order echoes Thomas's reflections. An example can illustrate how far the performative operations of the law can reach. With a remark critical of those approaches that see capital fundamentally as a social relation, Pistor notes that even labor, with a little bit of engineering, can easily be turned into capital, capital. The performative force of the law is displayed at its maximum power. Many a freelancer, for example, like a creative freelancer, for example, has discovered that she can capitalize her labor by establishing a corporate entity, contributing her services to it in kind, and taking out dividends as the corporation shareholder in lieu of a salary. This is a common possibility for those who do operate as a sort of individual producer in the gig economy in that sense. Under this account, law can manipulate the factors of production and even reverse them. The description of the relevant social relation itself is a legal exercise. The risk with this type of reconstruction is that the pendulum swings completely to the other side of the spectrum, where the law does all the work. And you can see that in the case of, how patents develop or trademarking. Crucially, the performative thesis entails that social reality is created by law as a self-description of itself. There seems to be no social remainder beyond the legal description. So, this position also implies a certain degree of malleability of legal norms as well. They're assemblage and combination of feasible because they are just forms, relatively unconstrained by the social context. And this is you could argue this is where, one of the issues of the value form arguments. Hence, the formal legal norms ought to be the main object of study. But as in the example of labor, the legal norms that declare gig economy employees as self-employed might not be enough to make those workers really autonomous. Rather, they seem to hide their de facto condition as wage workers. The failure to couple the analysis of the relevant legal norms with social relations runs the risk of producing a disembedded type of legal analysis that misses out on the dynamics of the relevant social practices. The same problem surfaces in another important theoretical contribution made by Pistor, that is the recovery and renewal of the important tradition of institutionalism in cooperation with other authors. Pistor has revived and updated the insights of institutionalist economists like Commons, etc. The recovery of this intellectual tradition has made the role of law even more pronounced. Now, one could argue, if you were sort of a bog standard mainstream economist, that a law is a constant or something in the case of transactions, et cetera. But the reality, of course, out there is that there are always institutions. In fact, legal institutionalists have put forward a legal understanding of institutions like a contract, marriage, property, the firm, and many others. This is particularly true, according to the institutionalists, of capitalist societies, as they are based on social rules, and the vast majority of the latter are either created or sanctioned by law. Such a view remains perfectly consistent with the one expounded in the Code of Capital. The constitutive view entails that given certain institutions are the building blocks of capitalism and that they are also legal formations, then the legal perspective has a privileged access to the reality of capitalism. Yet, in this way, it is assumed that the legal nature of the institution makes legal rationality predominant within the sphere of action regulated by it. Accordingly, the best way to address distortions or abuses in the realm of the political economy is by manipulating and transforming the legal form, hence the law and economics and the law and political economy movements. Given that the latter is constitutive, tweaking it will engender transformations of the relevant economic actions as well. It's clear that the message conveyed by this type of institutionalism is mostly directed to economists and political economists who have underestimated the function of law for a long time. However, the risk is, once again, that we move from a superficial and ineffective view of the law as an economic epiphenomenon to a perspective that sees social reality in a capitalist society constructed almost entirely by the codification and the assemblage of legal institutions. Such a move is based on a conception of the law that ultimately is not socially embedded. The problem arises because the institution is conceived as fundamentally made by a hierarchy of legal norms. While it's undeniable that institutions contain defining legal norms, their connection with social relations is also constitutive and cannot be ignored. institutions are couplings or hybrids. Uh, Contract, for example, is both an economic and a legal institution. The logic of action shaped by the institution is not driven only by legal norms, although they clearly have an impact on it, but by economic expectations as well. While most of the rules of contract are formalized legally, the point of the practice of contracting cannot be fully described only from a formalist legal perspective. Hence, a change in the formal legal rules might irritate the underlying logic of action of another subsystem, but it would not be enough to produce lasting and impactful effects. So ultimately, there is an end to all these matters, but there is also a kind of dominant overall legal structure that takes advantage of this. Now, I hope that's as clear as mud. That's as far as I want to go today. Uh, well, just because I have a limit to my yammering, and we don't want to get too far afield on this. But law is a fundamental part of the accumulation process, the structure of accumulation, per se, the social structure of accumulation that has primitive elements, but also has elements that are unfortunately unique to or specific to capitalism. So all of these elements apply in that context. Um, let's see if there are questions. Are there? Rubenesque slavery only enslaves plump people, I suppose.
Let me go back. I just put in the chat, I just learned today that Romanesque slavery differs from chattel slavery in that Romans still considered or were categorized as still being human beings. Roman slaves were still considered human beings. Chattel slavery denies this.
Yes, yes.
And so when you were talking about, yeah.
No, this is good. The status of this is what I was mentioning in terms of citizenship, defining citizenship versus slaves, for example, right?
Yeah, and you were saying that the Romans were the first people to do that category, and so I found that fascinating, and it ties in, I think, to that. So
one could argue that they are actually building on the Greeks in that context.
Okay, all right.
I mean, the difference is, you get, democracy from the Greeks, but you get law or more, rigorous application of it from the Romans. If you assume in classical culture that you're building off of, one over the other society.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The classical learning, in other words, is important from a Greek point of view. But when you apply, it becomes implemented in more interesting ways via the Romans.
Okay. Yeah, I missed a lot of that growing up, so thank you.
Well, it's a simplification of it, but the application of Roman law is much more rigorous across the empire than the Greeks in terms of, for example, it's that idea of a certain, well, anyway, differentiating between localized law and more sort of imperial law is important in some ways. It is adapted, I think, still within certain concepts of Anglo-American law. That is, sort of as law evolves in the British context. So there's still, Roman, as it were, elements to it.
And I'm just going to throw this out there, but it's also law of empire. Rome was so much of an empire eventually too. So just like,
Yes, very
yeah.
good. Yes, absolutely. Um, these imperial notions make, as I think we can appreciate in current politics, you can see how authoritarianism, you just fall over the edge a little bit and you've got fascism.
Oh, yes.
I just think that January 6th shows, how you can manipulate a kind of fascist tendency because it's all there. I mean, you just have to misapply certain precedents. They're still there. I think this is how Eastman manages to weasel around certain things to propose that, oh, well, it's perfectly possible for because it just hasn't been spelled out, for the vice president to sanction modifications in what is normally what we would all agree is just simply a ceremonial activity. But since there aren't any rules, we'll just make up this rule, because it wasn't there, which got fixed since January 6th. But there's another way to work around it that is more procedural and I think occurs at a different place in the process. So as I've mentioned before, if a state, a swing state, for example, decides to withhold its ballots, its electoral college ballots, it just bollockses up the system, hence creating these kind of delays, a delay, a potential delay, and then hence, some way in which as Roger Stone has described it, the way that the next insurrection will occur or the next seditious activity will occur is via judges in the courts.
Hmm. It seems like so much is riding. And I know everybody refers to the beer hall push, but January 6th and the beer hall push were, I believe that they were just antics. I'm going to try this.
Oh, yes.
There was no great philosophy or them saying, we are going to, change our form of democracy to fascism. There's none of that. It's an antic with a short-sighted goal. And so the legal, you know, uh, the legal aspect of that is trying to get a handle on just random antics somewhat. So that's
some of it is just simply distributional in the sense that that's why Ted Cruz mentions, I think, the 1876 election in his little sort of a speech supporting the idea of waiting to let the states. This was like his and Josh Hawley's little yammering during the kind of crisis of January 6th. No differently than sort of Eastman's general model, which he of course refines a little because he's trying to cover his ass. He develops Eastman does a 2-page memo and then a 6-page memo. And in the 6-page memo, he tries to sort of work out how he can't be convicted as a seditionist, sort of. I mean, it doesn't say that explicitly, but it's like, well, this explains it further, and this, essentially bogs you down with more legalisms. Lest you think that's unimportant, when Trump says, let the states handle issues about abortion, he's also mimicking or paralleling the states' rights argument that also is built into the kind of seditious behavior of January 6th. That is, the point was in the Eastman model is to bog it down so that it has to go back to the states or that it goes to a GOP-dominated Congress and hence sort of tied up with certain other machinations, noting that the speaker is third in line, right? And that's currently what it is, or second in line. to the top. So you could have some kind of insurrectionary activity, perhaps, but maybe you don't need it. That's the point, is that you could bog it down, and then since you have the Supreme Court on your side, then sort of get to another thing. Oh, I'm sorry, I've pursued this for. We digress. I'm sorry, Kelly.
I enjoyed it thoroughly, so thank you.
But essentially, this is the sort of, and I know I'm going to fight with people on this, but this is sort of the ninth and tenth. I have a minor interest. I had a minor interest in Lowe those many days ago in graduate school, and I always thought it was still a good idea. I still think it's a good idea to talk about the unenumerated rights components of the Ninth and Tenth Amendments, because so much is lost or less explicit, let's say, or hidden by the statements of the Ninth and Tenth Amendments about uh, rules that we have these kind of rules, constitutional rules, but you know, uh, if we haven't mentioned them, they're still there somewhere. They're just not enumerated, which covers a whole variety of sins. I mean, in other words, this is the linchpin for states' rights approaches to things like abortion, which is why Trump yammers about, oh well, we'll send it back to the states. It was his way of getting around the fact that he was, in the first instance, he was parroting, well, we want to get to an absolute, a national rule on reproductive rights, and then he had to dial that back to instances of rape or incest, and then ultimately, well, I'm not going to talk about this anymore. We've sent it back to the states, mainly because he's not competent to talk about it.
And he doesn't want to make a commitment because he's gonna, upset some of his fans either way.
Oh, well, yeah, he recognizes, as he tried to disavow Project 2025, it's all there. you know, how I did it, or what we want to do.
Right. Crazy.
It's not anything new that the Heritage Foundation wants to do. Project 2025 is just the laundry list of all the stupid shit they wanted, excuse me, the stupid stuff they wanted to do for decades. Like, for example, eradicating the federal Department of Education.
Which is chilling.
Well, yes, exactly. There are other things that might, the same argument could be applied to certain other departments. There, it's not the Fed's, business to do certain things, et cetera, et cetera. We have more local sovereign rights because it's our state, right?
Yeah. Okay.
That
Yeah.
we can pollute our environment, and who cares whether our rivers happen to course into another state, right?
Oh yeah, that's contentious.
It's a national question. Federal questions are national questions, and they're nationalist questions in some ways.
Yeah.
And it seems fairly typical. It's just that, fortunately, there's a certain Republican absolutism that is at work at the present moment, and they're not sufficiently adaptable to see that there are a lot of people, many of whom just simply don't vote because they're not required to vote or whatever, that actually the country believes a certain different thing, but they try to ignore that by using certain tools like electoral college, et cetera, to try and maintain their hold on power. Anyway, but I digress. Thanks, Kelly. Is there any other things, comments, brickbats, interventions? Okay, Joe, you can shut the live stream down and we can return to our regular program. Oh, I'm the host with the most. All right, now, if I am the host, let me don't mind me. Here it is.